Hi, my name is Mridula, and I'm the Director of PLM for Subscriber Quality of Experience. This year, we saw a lot of advancement in encryption, especially for applications. And some of this is listed here, where we have TLS and quick encryption, which affects application subclassification, what we call as app content. We do have iCloud Private Relay or Relay kind of VPN type of applications, which affects the application classification itself and also the content classification. And then this year was special because we saw a lot of encrypted client hello, as well as obfuscation of traffic and advanced encryption within TLS over and beyond what TLS was doing until 2023. So here you can see a flow which is passing through active logic. And you can see that because the SNI or the server hostname is encrypted or not usable, it doesn't match with any of the patterns that would exist as a signature. You can see that the application is getting classified as SSL, and the app content is other, or gets into the other apps. And also TLS 1.3, this traffic is going over TLS 1.3, and the SNI is not usable for classification or identifying the application. I've turned on the new feature, which is called as Application Recognition Repository, which does a deterministic check of other features outside of SNI to determine what is the traffic or what is the application that the user has been using. See that I've enabled classification for that, and with the feature, we see the same flow being now classified as meta apps. So for applications like from the same provider, application server provider like Meta, who has multiple applications, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, etc. We would be, with any deterministic method, when the SNI is encrypted, we can classify it as meta apps. That is to say that it's one of the applications in that group. And you can see that happen here, and that application gets classified into social media because the more chance is that it is going to be a social media application. The same SNI you can see, as you saw in the previous flow. That flow which was classified as SSL is now classified as meta app. We go one step further with classification through deep learning-based methods, where what you saw as SSL when there was no other advanced methods turned on, now has the deep learning-based classification enabled, and you can see that the exact application what the user used is classified here, which is the WhatsApp application, and the user is doing messaging through WhatsApp, and the application category now changes to communication. So the same exact SNI over TLS 1.3, but with features like deep learning, we have classified it into the exact application here. So this is how we future-proof our classification solution.